Good evening, America, and my Maple Leaf friends up north. Some people call that northern Montana, but my teammates, Rod Martin and Pastor Rhett Burns, are joining me today to discuss Cross Politics' recent bar fight that we kind of got in. And I could potentially by the end of the show end up on the mat, with two Baptists pinning me down or just maybe a bloody nose and paying for the first round of drinks after the match. We'll see. So grab your best scotch or Dr. Pepper and enjoy this discussion and show. But first, Dime Payments is a Christian-owned processing payment business. Every business needs a payment processing system. So please go to dimepayments.com/FLF. These guys are great. And sign your business up. Working with them supports us. They won't cancel us, like they canceled Trump. Like Stripe canceled Trump. They won't cancel you like MailChimp canceled the Babylon Bee. So check them out. At least have a phone call and tell them Cross Politics sent you. Go to dimepayments.com/FLF. Belly flop or cannonball? Brings a new meaning to that this week, doesn't it? This past week and a half has been a busy one for us as our show last Wednesday caused a a big public relations debacle with our Baptist brothers. Now, for the last 5 years or so, Presbyterians and Baptists, I think, have labored in very encouraging ways and tried to work with each other and do their best as, kindred spirits, and do their best as possible despite some of our theological differences. I've really enjoyed the camaraderie from all this and encouragement that has come from that, and hope it continues down this bumpy road God has us all on. Founders and Tom Askell invited us and Pastor Toby to speak at his conference in 2019. Cross Politics also did a live show with Vody, Bauckham, and Josh Bice and Tom and Jared at that same conference. G3 and Josh Bice invited us to do shows at their conference in 2020, and we had Josh Bice come and speak at our high school worldview camp up here in Moscow. We had Jeff Durbin and Rod Martin spoke at that camp also. We had Jeff Durbin and Apologia speak at our missions conference. Apologia has had Pastor Toby speak at their conference. Dr. James White spoke at Grace Agenda. Jeff Durbin spoke at our first ever Fight, Laugh, Feast conference. And all these joint efforts have been surrounded by healthy debate hasn't been neglected in all this. There's actually been a lot of healthy debate and back and forth regarding our differences over the years, despite the invitations and conferences, speaking and supporting and platforming and so forth. Actually, this debate reminds me of a debate that occurred between a Baptist and a Presbyterian minister. And they got into this baptism debate over the mode of baptism, sprinkle, immersion, pouring, immersion, so forth. The Presbyterian minister said he could prove to the Baptists that pouring or sprinkling water on the head was sufficient. Stay with me. And so the Presbyterian asked, if the candidate was in water up to his ankles, would that be enough? The Baptist pastor said, absolutely not. And he snapped back, in this way. Then the Presbyterian pastor responded and said, how about up to his knees? Baptist pastor responded and said, no, not good enough. Not good enough, the Baptist pastor huffed. So the Presbyterian pastor responded and said, okay, then, how about up to his waist? Okay. Baptist pastor said, nope. The Presbyterian minister responded and said, well, what if he was immersed in water up to his chest? That wouldn't be a baptism. The Baptist pastor responded, all right, would you accept it if it was up to his neck? And of course, the Baptist pastor was, no. Then how about if he was in water all the way up to his forehead? The water kind of came up to here. Would that be good enough? Baptist pastor responded and said, no, 1,000 times no, that would not work. Well, then the Presbyterian responded, it's just as I said, only water that goes up, only water that is poured on the head indicates a legitimate baptism. There you go. So all this fellowship that has also included a good bit of debate has really been a genuine work of the Holy Spirit. I mean, I don't see how it could not. There's been a real joyfulness in this work with each other, a real desire for fellowship with each other. That's been true. And at the same time, a real genuine back and forth in debate that has arisen from all this, and still fellowship. It's been my prayer through all this last week and a half that this only spurs on greater fellowship joyfulness and a genuine back and forth here. So let me recap just for those who are tuning in, didn't see last Wednesday's show, didn't really see the debacle that was created in all this. Let me recap a little bit of the show here as I kind of adjust some of my notes of what's going on here. Hopefully this recap is sufficient, but go back and listen to the shows too. So the fireworks started on our show last Wednesday. The show titled From Slavery to Abortion to Transgenderism, the church led us to the trans movement. That was the title of the show. Our friend Jason Farley connected the current trans identity crisis to the radical individualism found in generic American Baptist culture. Having grown up in the South and after living in California for a couple of years, this made sense to me, and I agreed with Jason. Now, the backstage portion of the show, something that we generally reserve for club members, Jason went on to say that Baptists are the cause of the trans identity crisis. One of the rubs in play is that Chocolate Knox also closed out the first part of this discussion in the first show, telling Jason that he wanted to get to how our covenantal Baptist brothers might be connected to this generic American Baptist line of thinking. Obviously, you are hearing my summary here, as I mentioned, so feel free to go to the app and listen to the shows and hear for yourself. There has been a lot of gracious, so that's kind of my gist summary. There's a lot more that's gone on, and there's been a lot of gracious interaction, debate, and friendly punches since that show from our Baptist brothers swinging at us, whether they are asking for clarification to outright disappointment regarding what we said. Now, let me say it here, that we do not believe our Reformed Baptist brothers are the cause of the transgendered identity crisis in our society for two reasons. First, our Reformed Baptist brothers were not the target of our definition of that radical individualistic generic American Baptist theology turned secular. We just didn't have them as part of that definition. And secondly, I tweeted this out, that we had friends like, James White in mind. We didn't have him in mind when we were talking about this, American generic Baptist a view of the whole issue. And because James White, my brother, gets the covenant better than a lot of my Presbyterian brothers. James will baptize a 4-year-old and bring them to the Lord's table. My Presbyterian brothers will baptize babies and refuse them the Lord's table until the child passes the test. Whatever test the elders put before him, usually between the ages of some sort of 8 to 12 years old. So James, in my mind, was not the target of our definition. We were talking about radical Baptistic, individualistic, view of identity, which means our Reformed Baptist brothers were not the target of our conversation. James, like I said, I think understands covenant better than my Presbyterian brothers. Let me say one more thing here about our show, and this is where I understand some things here. Our show is like walking into a bar and listening to 3 Presbyterians drink and talk with their friends. The joke that 3 Presbyterians walk into a bar and the bartender responds and says, "Sorry, we're only allowed to serve beer to people who are 21 years and older." So Presbyterians maybe could be a little mature a little bit on some of this bar fight stuff. So my point is, we are not a systematic theological podcast. That's not us. And so in this sense, I understand the frustrations of our Reformed Baptist friends who believe we said they were at fault for our current trans trends in our society. Our conversations are not always tight. Our transitions from leaving the show, as been pointed out, and going to backstage portion of the show does not always connect, and so forth. And so I ask that you would hear our clarifications and take them at face value. Now, to our discussion. My team of contributors include Baptist and Presbyterian, and so for today I have just Rod Martin, who actually used to be on the executive committee for the Southern Baptist Convention, and Rhett Burns, who is currently a pastor in the SBC, joining us to have kind of a free-range discussion on the fallout from our show from last Wednesday. From everything in between, kind of all the blog posts that have happened. There's just been a lot that's gone on since the fallout from last show. So thank you, Rod and Rhett, for joining us. And as I mentioned in our text before coming on the show, that speak freely as we kind of hopefully have a good conversation around all this. Now, Rod, I'm gonna have you come in first because I I've seen a couple tweets here and there from you, but I really don't. I maybe have a better understanding where Rhett stands, but I really quite don't know where you stand on this whole debacle. So I'd love for you to kind of just, fill me in where you're coming from and what your thoughts are on this whole situation.
Well, I mean, honestly, I think a lot of people have talked about this. Tom Asheville wrote a good article on this. James White's talked about this. I don't want to beat you guys up or anything. I love what y'all said just about as much as if you would have loved it if I had accused you of being responsible for the Holocaust or something. So, obviously I don't like what was said, but I mean, you guys are friends. I mean, I don't just love your show. I love you guys individually, and that certainly includes Jared, for heaven's sake. We've been friends for a long time. So I just really have two main points. I mean, one theological and one very practical. Theologically, I think really the whole argument just tries to prove too much. I mean, there's a sense in which literally everything wrong in the world could be laid at the feet of the church.
Sure.
You really can make that argument, but I think it goes too far a lot of the time. I mean, honestly, and Doug Wilson made an argument, I think in 2006, at some length in Credenda Agenda, that all homosexuality was the fault of Christian fathers. And eventually he recanted that because there was truth in a lot of what he was saying, but it really was just too much. Because the reality is, take transgenderism. What is transgenderism really? It's not the logical descent of errors in Christianity. It's an absolute rejection of God and his creation, and in two parts. I mean, it is an absolute rebellion against God, but it's also a rebellion against the idea that God has any right to decide what the creation is and is for. It's really Eve in the garden saying, no, I'm not going to listen to God's rules for what he gave me. I actually get to decide not just what's right and wrong, but what is and isn't. It's an even more fundamental rebellion than the normal ethical rebellion. It is a rebellion against the idea that there can be a definition of reality external to the person asserting it. And that's way beyond just some dumb thing some Christian group may say that leads down the slippery slope. It's actually just a fundamental rejection of God and everything having to do with God. So that would be my theological point. I think y'all were trying to prove too much. I think it's well intentioned, but I think it just proves too much. And then the second thing is very practical. We are in a battle for Christendom. We are in a battle for Christian civilization. You guys have done a better job of working across the aisle than just about anybody I can point at. And I applaud you for that. I love you for that. I would just say what Ben Franklin said: we can all hang together, or we will surely hang separately. And, fighting each other right now over these things, it's the same debate we had at the beginning of the Conservative Baptist Network, where we're trying to deal with the rise of wokeness in SBC institutions. There were a lot of people there who were very adamant that the real fight is with the Calvinists. And I said, guys, come on, write systematic theologies at each other later. Right now, we need all hands on deck against something far more pernicious than anything you might think about each other. We actually have to stand together in this time. And I would encourage that here. It's not that I don't have an issue with, actually, I would have a bigger issue with some of the things that were said in the backstage show about what to a Baptist almost sounds like baptismal regeneration. But I'm not going to sit around here and beat up Knox because he wants everybody to baptize their baby. And, that's what Knox believes. I'm good with that. I don't agree with it, but it's not heretical from my point of view. I just think he's wrong. And I don't want to spend a lot of time smacking Knox around for his sign-off every week. I want to work with Knox to beat the real bad guys. And again, we can write books at each other later and we can be kind about it. But let's not do anything that destroys the unity in the day of real battle against real enemies.
Now, Rod, you've always kind of struck me as a I mean, I don't know maybe the best way to define you, but definitely kind of like a theological, pragmatist. Which is I think kind of assesses the perspective you're coming from, where you want unity, and I think we all do. I'm not saying no one else does, but when I've also talked about like political battles with you on our show, that tends to be your general assessment is let's lock arms, let's fight here, and then let's discuss our theological differences later. That's kind of usually your general take on things.
I would not call it a theological pragmatism so much as an operational pragmatism.
Okay.
Again, I can sit around and argue with you guys about paedobaptism all day long, and I have a strong opinion. But when I've got people coming for the definition of reality itself, I'm going to focus fire on the bigger battle.
Yeah.
And then in peacetime, we can shoot each other all day long.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, you hinted on this a little bit, talking about kind of the church's influence on culture, and then you can probably generally kind of pin that 30,000-foot view, generally speaking, or please don't let me put words in your mouth, but that you could see that the church can be responsible for most things that happen in our culture. Is that a fair?
There's a level on which that's inevitably true.
Okay.
And I'm not disagreeing with the general thrust of what was said, just with the specifics.
And one thing I was thinking of, I actually had this offline debate with James White, but you'll probably hear this on the. Make sure you guys check out our show with James White that we had on Friday. I was kind of thinking about this a little bit, kind of the church's responsibility for culture, and if I walked into Corinth and it's just a straight pagan nation. I'm walking in, I'm as a pastor, I'm telling my deacons, stop going to the temple prostitutes, telling this guy, hey man, you married your dad's wife, you're excommunicated, you're out of here unless you repent. It's like I'm unwinding a paganism out of that society. I'm not blaming the church for that paganism. But if I come to like a Christian America, where I see, and this is probably to your point, Rod, where America that had been saturated with the Christian influence for a while, I'm going to assess things differently about the church and that culture. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Kind of big 30,000 foot. America's a Christian nation. Yeah, you could probably pin most things on the church.
Well, there's a level on which that's true. I mean, there's no question about it. If there are failings in not necessarily Baptist theology, I wouldn't necessarily go there, but I would say Baptist practice in a lot of quarters has been problematic, and there are a lot of Baptist churches I wouldn't belong to. I would say the same thing about Presbyterianism, but I wouldn't lay all of the flaws of. Okay, I'll give you a perfect example. It would be easy to blame Presbyterianism, or at least Reformed faith more broadly, for the Unitarianism that took over Massachusetts and New England over time. It would be easy to say, well, see, if they hadn't done X, Y, and Z. And actually, Gary North makes a pretty compelling argument that the Halfway Covenant is responsible for what ultimately happened at Harvard and so forth. And he is a was a Presbyterian, so he's self-criticizing.
He is now. He really knows his Presbyterianism now.
He really does, one way or the other. But regardless, the point just is, I think that's proving too much too. Is it true that they did things that were wrong and mistakes and we should learn from? 100%. Is it true that they caused anybody to reject God and become a Unitarian? No, that's absurd. I don't believe that's true. I think that things they did contributed to it. I think that's a fair criticism. But ultimately, we're each responsible for what we choose to believe about God and for our rebellion against Him.
Yeah. One last thing here, and then I want to bring Rhett in here in a minute. I think one of the things that we try to, cross politic, our main target is to bring the gospel into politics and culture. And so we're constantly, and we do this with our own Presbyterian denomination. We do this with charismatics, Episcopalians, Baptists. We're constantly trying to assess, okay, what's the connection of the church here, and what Bible verses apply here? So if this manifestation of sin is out there, well, where maybe could it have begun in the church? And I think that's a healthy analysis or a healthy conversation. I'm not saying that we all the time get it right, but I think that's that conversation is something I would like to see more of in our churches, about, okay, what did we get wrong here, and how maybe that might have manifested itself out in the world out there. And so I think that's part of the spirit of the constant conversation we have on Cross Politic, where we're doing that with. I mean, I think Presbyterianism is responsible for Revoice. I think Presbyterianism is responsible for a lot of the LGBT making its way into the reform world, 100%. And I think I can draw a pretty good dotted line there.
Well, I really hate to defend Presbyterians, because that just kind of goes against my constitution. But I think that proves too much, or attempts to. I think individual Presbyterian leaders have absolutely thrown gasoline on the fire of Revoice. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that the Westminster Confession is responsible for Revoice. And that's really the distinction I'm drawing. Yeah. I think the conversation that you constantly engage in is fantastic, and it is right-headed, and we need to have that all the time. Mm-hmm. I think to say that Baptist theology gets you transgenderism is just, I mean, if you wanted to say that, from a Presbyterian point of view, that there are aspects of Baptist theology or practice that have gotten you toward the point where certain people are marinated in bad ideas so much that it fertilized the garden that transgenderism grew in. Yeah. That's a fair criticism. I actually couldn't disagree with that. To say that Baptist theology gets you transgenderism is silly.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, and I'll bring Rhett in for this part of the thing. That's where I would say, well, we weren't maintaining Baptist theology. The context for us was kind of this generic American Baptist, which I'd be happy to include kind of broad evangelicalism in this, that is kind of that outworking, the practice of that outworking of kind of this radical individualism is what is responsible for transgendered, identity crisis out there. But
yeah, there's a heteropraxy issue that is pervasive in the church, and everybody wants to blame it on the American church or whatever. No, we actually see it in a lot of the rest of the world too. This is not a great era for Christendom, to be perfectly blunt, anywhere. And there's no question that the operational theology of people, in many cases, which I would really categorize more precisely within practice, is very poor and leads to a lot of error that is beyond the error that the people engaging in it realize it will result in. Yeah. I think that's fair, and I think that's true in Presbyterianism also. I just think, again, say it for the last time, I think you guys tried to prove too much. I think that it's actually a very interesting thought that radical individualism in the church would get you there. I just don't think it got you there alone. I think it allowed the conditions in which that much bigger rebellion could flourish. I think that's a fair point.
Okay, let me bring Rod in. I know Rod, Rhett, not Rod. Let me bring Rhett into this. Rhett, you've gotten into the weeds a little more here on all this. Kind of just give me your general summary and thoughts, and love to go something back and forth here.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to agree and situate this, I don't know, controversy, whatever you want to call it, within the context of gratitude and friendship like you have. I think that's important. I think what Rod laid out about why this matters in terms of the, kind of the cultural battle that we're in and the partnership and between camaraderie between, Paedo Baptists and Credo Baptists over the last few years. I do think that's why this is important, this conversation. As I think about it, I think there's really two interrelated but distinct things going on over the last week and a half. So I think there's what I would call the original error, and I do want to argue that it is an error of what was said there on the show. It was just that. I don't think it was, sinful or anything like that. I think it was wrong. But so I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing is over the last, week and a half, the double down, the triple down, the quadruple down. I think that has some practical implications as well that I think we need to talk about. But to the original point and what you and Rob were talking about, I would argue, I think we have a misapplication of your principle. And then I think we had on those shows, I think there's a misrepresentation. I don't think it was intentional, but I do think there was a misrepresentation of Credo Baptist thought and theology there. But first, just because it goes along with what you and Rob were talking about, I agree with the principle that culture is downstream from religion and that worship flow, what happens in the sanctuary flows out into the world. I think it's a pattern we see in the Bible. I think it's right. Where I would disagree with, your application of that principle is I don't think everything that happens in the culture can be traced back to the church because Christians aren't the only ones worshiping. And so you have, all people are worshipers. God created us that way. Worship's inescapable. We're all going to worship something. And that worship then flows out into the world. So what we see is downstream from worship, but not necessarily downstream from the church. And so as one example, I was thinking about a few years ago, I think it was an old Douglas Wilson lecture on Islam. And he talked about, he connected the dots between dictatorships in in predominantly Muslim countries to their radical Unitarian conception of God, and where God in his essence is not love, but power. And so he traces it back to that false worship, right? And I think there's something to that. But what's not being traced there is you're not tracing the dictatorships and things that come out in Islamic culture to the handful of house churches in any particular Muslim country, because we're not tracing it back to the church, we're tracing it back to worship. And I think that's the principle. And so if we trace everything back to the church, and I'm not saying there's not some relations, and I'm not saying there's, some perversions and things that come out of that, but I am saying to trace back it as a cause, I think it's misapplication. And, I almost hate to say it, but like that's the Russell Moore, David French playbook. Every Sunday essay of David French is blame the church. And I don't want to see you guys go down that route. And I don't think y'all go in the same way that he does. But the principle of blaming the church is one that I want to dispute and say, I think that's a misapplication of the principle of, worship flows to the world.
Can I enter here? Enter here, Rhett? Don't forget your other point. If you need to write it down, don't forget it.
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily also disagree with all that assessment. Especially as a Christian nation gets more and more pagan, I think the church loses that massive influence that it had and things get more and more pagan, and it's just a result of just outright rejection of God and pagan sin. So I wouldn't want to connect everything to the church as a church gets more and more pagan. But I think what we want to all, I think, kind of just reserve to try to do is to do our best to say where can the church specifically be responsible for what's going on in our nation now. Education, not discipling our kids well, that's a good example. Putting our kids in public school, that's a good example. And the more we can find where we can take responsibility, that's directly either connected maybe from a misapplication of our theology or some bad theology or some theology that's gone secularized, where whatever's going on. Like I said earlier, I think I can easily draw dots to Presbyterians and Revoice. I don't think that's hard at all. I mean, I think you have a bunch of noteworthy Presbyterians out there who are not holding the line good at all in all this, and they represent us. Tim Keller is a good example. They represent us well, and I think in the same way the Baptist SBC has some representation, by Rick Warren, some representation by, some general American Baptist representation by Robert Jeffries out of Texas, those kind of things. So I think we can draw, dotted lines to some of these things that are going on in our culture. But at the same time, I don't disagree with you that there's some things.
I agree. I agree. We can draw some dotted lines here and there and make some relations. I'm just saying that's a lot different than what was said on those shows. When you talk about calls, and kind of laying it at the feet of, I do think that's a different thing.
Yeah. Well, and I guess maybe I drawing a dotted line. Let me just address the word cause that we used on our show. So in the backstage, Jason Farley said, in my mind, and you can talk through this too, Rhett, in my mind, we were talking about the individualistic, radical kind of individualism found in generic Baptist theology that has caused the identity crisis in our transgendered world, America. And that word cause, I think is I understand some of the consternation that word has caused. I think as Presbyterians, the way we think about this is we think covenantally. So I talked to one friend. He brought up the word caused. He really had a problem with that. And one of his points was, you're saying that I'm morally culpable. And my response to him was like, actually, I don't know if you are or not. And I think the better word for me to communicate to you would be the word responsible. I think the church is responsible for this. I think the church is responsible for this. I think the Presbyterians are responsible for this. I think the Baptists are responsible for this, whatever. Then that word responsible, I think, communicates that, we should be able to see that dotted line. We should be able to draw the dotted line between our actions over here in the church and out in our culture. But at the same time, it doesn't also communicate moral culpability. I mean, it could. It just depends on what's going on. So Jesus took responsibility for our sins. He wasn't morally culpable at all.
Sure.
I'm a father, and I'm responsible for my family. And when my son sins, I may or may not be morally culpable for my son's sins. I'm definitely responsible for my son's sins. And in some situations, a father can, Ephesians chapter 6, a father can frustrate his kids into sin. I
don't disagree with that point.
Go ahead.
I don't think that's necessarily what was. If it was what was meant, what was communicated. If that, I think there's an equivocation maybe on the word there, cause, and I don't want to get caught up on that too much. I do think there's been a little bit of a pivot to talking about the radical individualism that I think that was definitely at play. I mean, y'all were talking about that in Truman's book and various things. I think some of that was imported to Baptist theology, that maybe some of it we've seen in practice, and I don't want to ignore the fact that Stephen Furtick, about an hour and a half north of me, does these spontaneous baptisms and things like that that are just kind of really bad practices. But I think there was some things said about Baptist theology that I didn't recognize. And so there was a lot talked about, that kids just get to choose their identity when they get to whatever number of years old, at this age of accountability. It's on the show, you had it in your blog post. And that's just I don't see that. I haven't seen that. I've been in just generic Southern Baptist, American Baptist churches all of my life. And what we don't say that a kid gets to determine their identity at, whatever that age of accountability is, 8 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old, whatever. We don't say that. We say that God chooses when to convert someone. And then when someone is giving evidence of, they're professing faith, and then we're going, then we'll baptize them, because we see that repentance and faith and regeneration and baptism kind of, those go together in the scriptures. And so we don't say that they just get to choose. We say God chooses. God is the one who saves, and he's the one who converts. And then after that, we will baptize them. But it's not even an individual decision either. It's not just, I'm not saying this never happens, but generally speaking, you have the individual, who is
Mhm.
professing faith. If they're a child, you have their parents, you have their pastor
Mhm.
involved, you have their church involved. They're watching their life. Are they showing,
Mhm.
the fruit of the Spirit and fruit of repentance, things
Mhm.
like that? And so I think you see the biblical pattern of having 2 or 3 witnesses before you make a judgment.
Mhm.
That's going in, and it's not just the child kind of willy-nilly getting to say, "Oh, I'm a Christian now, baptize me." It's, "I believe in Jesus now. I have repented of my sins," and walking through that with those who are responsible for them, their parents and their pastors. And so
Mhm.
I think there was a little bit, maybe, I don't know if it's misunderstanding or misrepresentation unintentionally, but I do think that's an important point there, because how that was represented isn't Credo Baptist
Yeah.
theology.
Yeah. And I absolutely understand that that's the Credo Baptist theology.
Yeah.
I would there's 2 responses there. One is I agree with you that that's there. And I also have my own personal interaction with this stuff, being a Christian in Texas, in the thick Baptist culture in Texas, where there's gonna be some differences on that take, but I agree with you in what you're saying there. And I'd say, thirdly, one thing that is at play for sure here is the Presbyterian worldview of how we understand baptism in kids. I'm sure you're very, part of at play is that, Presbyterians believe that their kids, when they're born, they're part of the covenant people of God, whether they're genuinely saved or not, but they, at least this is where the identity connection that we were talking
Mhm.
about. We believe that they identify as God's people in the covenant of God, because they were born into a Christian family. Just like in an Old Testament Israelite, when their kid was born into the covenant people of God.
Mhm.
That's why they would get circumcised. And so without trying to draw all the dotted lines that everyone's been trying to draw from
Sure.
what I'm saying, when we talk about kind of this radical individualistic Baptist view, and I can give you a lot of examples of this from friends, families, and so forth. They largely their kids, especially in Texas, I can give you multiple examples of Texas, but especially they'll teach their kids that they aren't Christians until they're ready to accept Jesus in their heart. When they're, most of my friends in Texas were probably baptized in between that 12 and 16-year range. And this is just my circles in Texas. I understand there's other churches different ways. And so for 12 years, 13 years, 15 years, they would say, "No, you aren't a Christian," and they'd all go worship together, and then they would take the Lord's Supper while their 12-year-old kid wasn't allowed to take the Lord's Supper, and just creating this identity crisis in their children, because they aren't supposedly saved, even though the parents don't really know or not. And so that, to me, was what we were getting at, was kind of that radical. And now I got tons of Baptist friends also, especially on the Reformed Baptist side, where they're teaching their kids to pray when they're 6 months old. They're teaching their kids catechism when they can talk. They're teaching, it's like they're very different, even though they might have some of similar expression of believers' baptism between those two camps. They're far more covenantal on how they're raising their kids and viewing their kids than this other side that I was trying to clearly communicate, or trying to talk into, and then my blog post kind of, I hope, elaborated on that. So
two
there's some
things.
worldview things there.
Sure, 2 things there. First of all, if I understand things correctly, Texans cause transgenderism. Then, am I right? That comes out of Texas.
Oh man, we could go. That hurts a little bit, but man, we got Governor Abbott as a governor there. So
No, the second question that comes to mind, and you kind of hit on it there at the end, but I think a question would be: do you think that Baptists, is it your understanding that Baptists treat their kids like pagans, like self-consciously? Are they thinking of their kids as pagans?
Well, again, I think the radical individual.
Okay.
Baptists, absolutely. I mean, I had friends who literally wouldn't teach their kids how to pray because a wicked prayer is abomination to the Lord.
I do think that's the small minority. I think what you have the small minority who are kind of weird about that type of stuff. And honestly, I've never run into it. I've heard about it, but I've actually never run into that. I think you have then a little bit larger group that are your Reformed Baptist, and then you have your broad group that is just kind of, to use Jared's term from the show the other day, the loosey goosey, and they'll baptize as soon as they say they love Jesus, and
and 5 times in 5 years, every year they'll baptize again.
And so,
make sure I get this right.
But I do think that I don't think Baptists, generally speaking, view their kids like pagans. I think most kind of that broad, that largest group are doing it unconsciously. I think you have others who are careful about what they're thinking. And so here's how I think. I don't think of my kids as pagans. They're not baptized yet, but I don't think of them as pagans. I think of them as they are in a Christian family, and they are covenantally connected to one who is in covenant with Christ, their father and their mother. And so I think we are thinking covenantally there. They are in a family, and the head of their family is loyal to Christ and belongs to Christ. And so they are connected in that way. And honestly, I just don't see it terribly much different than how Presbyterians think of their kids as being in the objective people of God, but not necessarily converted yet. I think of our kids in the same way. I think there's some people who do that are Baptists. I think others, they're not necessarily thinking covenantally in that way, because I think probably they haven't been taught to, but they're still thinking of their family as a Christian family and their kids as Christian kids. And sometimes in ways that are unhealthy, because they'll baptize unconverted 5-year-olds when they first say they love Jesus, and then they grow up and they're unregenerate, and we have those same problems. But I don't think that Baptists are really thinking of their kids as pagans and not Christians, and giving them that identity of belonging to a Christian people.
So you kind of highlighted, I mean, we can always, kind of geographically layer the soil in each denomination, this denomination, and you kind of gave a little bit of the layering as, the small crazy group who we just mentioned wouldn't even teach their kids to pray. We can call that the small crazy group. I'm totally fine calling that. They wouldn't teach their kids to pray because they believe their kids aren't Christians, and they don't want their kids to be a wicked prayer that's an abomination to the Lord. That's the small crazy group, 100% there. Sure. And then you mentioned kind of the Reformed Baptist, which is bigger, and I agree with. And those are the brothers that we were not talking about in this. And then you mentioned the broader kind of unthinking Baptist world. And I actually, we were talking specifically about kind of the radical Baptist individualism, but I could throw a whole bunch of evangelicals into this camp too. This is just a very broad category, and I agree with you that they are genuine in how they're raising their kids, but the unthinking part is where I think the problem's at, because that parent who's God, Jesus, Bible, Friday night football, they're raising their kid the best they can to love Jesus, but there's this unthinking communication that's going on that I don't think most of the generic Baptist world understands. That's causing havoc in a lot of ways. So my Reformed Baptist brothers aren't part of this because, like I said, I can't tell you how many of my Reformed Baptist brothers where I'm going to their house and their 2-year-olds singing and raising their hands. It's great. It's covenantal, right? But this unthinking Baptist evangelical framework where your kids are born into your family, and then you go to church, and even your 8-year-old, whatever age, you can think of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever. You as mom and dad, you go take the Lord's Supper in that church service, and you tell your kids, stay here. This meal is not for you yet. What do you think that kid is concluding in that moment? I'm part of mom and dad's family, but I'm not part of God's family. I must not be a Christian. So I think there's some unthinking things that some evangelical and broader Baptist parents are doing that are actually causing that identity crisis. They're communicating that they aren't saved, even though that maybe they believe they're raising their kid well in the church, but they're actually communicating that their kid aren't saved in all their kind of unspoken actions in what they're doing in the church.
I don't know that they're communicating that their kids aren't saved. I'm thinking maybe they're communicating, one, the importance of believers' baptism. They're communicating the importance of regeneration and faith, of repentance, and they're communicating this idea of growing up into Christ and maturity as well. And so I'm just having a hard time making that jump from Credo Baptist theology and the more responsible versions of Credo Baptist practice. I recognize there's some unresponsible as well. I don't get that jump. I don't think that's there. I think what Rod said, that it kind of proves too much, is accurate, and so I think that's kind of where the rub is. I think you need to make that case a little bit better. I think I made a really good case for radical individualism being a problem, and I will amen that. I will clap for that. I will, I'm not going to argue with you on that. I think where the rub came in on those shows is you didn't title that backstage show "The Failure of Radical Individualism." You titled it "The Failure of Baptist Theology," and the entire lead up in the regular show, and I like Jason Farley a lot. Anytime I've listened to him on Unplugged, anytime I've read him back when we both wrote for the old blog when it first started. I love But every time Farley talked in that opening show and into the backstage, he either explicitly by naming Baptist or implicitly by description, he was talking about and connecting the dots between Baptist theology and the transgender crisis. Now, Jared, I think, tried to, he went off in some really helpful directions with, Truman and Lewis. And I think Knox tried to give Farley a couple of ways out, and you did as well, tried to soften it. But it was pretty persistent on that. And so that's why I think Baptists have objected. And that's why you mentioned earlier about some of Toby's posts, and I love Toby, and I appreciate, in his last post, he addressed me and Jeff Wright directly, and just flat out kind of directly said, he thought we were wrong, and I appreciate that. I think directness is kindness, and so, but I would return the kindness and say directly, I think he's wrong there. That we're, the charge was that we weren't exegeting that show the way we would Scripture. But if I look at the Scripture passage, and everything was about Baptists leading to transgenderism, and with the one explicit statement in the middle that Baptist calls transgenderism, and the title of the chapter was Baptist, the failure of Baptist theology. Like, I would be right to make that conclusion that that's what was being said. I appreciate all the clarifications and all of that. I do think where the rub comes down on kind of the controversy part is on that kind of double down, triple down of, we were talking about this, but actually we weren't talking about these people, and we were talking about this, but we said this, and maybe some equivocation on terms. I think that's where the controversy kind of came to. And so I think that's where I think just acknowledging the error, or that, I would say it was an error, or, trying to prove too much or whatever else. If anything, what you're trying to say wasn't clear. I think some acknowledgement there rather than doubling down is where the controversy kind of goes away, and we can get back to doing our cultural warring together.
Yeah. So was it, do you think it was clear in the first show that we were talking about radical, we used the specific term, American Baptist theology gone secular? Do you think that was clear that we weren't talking about Reformed Baptists in the first show? Not the backstage show.
I don't think it was clear. And the reason I say that is because at that point, when you're talking about baptizing your kids after they profess faith, that's not distinct to Reformed or non-Reformed. It was kind of the thing that we share, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so I think that could have hit anybody. That was
sure.
baptism.
But like I did in this show, I was trying to say, like, I understand that, Reformed Baptists and this broader evangelical, individualistic Baptist culture, you guys might, the way you baptize might look the same, but your presuppositions of how you get there are very different, and it shakes out in how you raise your kids and how you view your kids. So I agree that these two different camps, Reformed Baptist and this radical, let's just keep using the term radical individualistic Baptist camp, are, baptizing their kids at, 11, 10, 8, 14 years old, whatever it is. But your worldview and assumptions are very different in what is in how you approach your kids, which is our primary concern and all that in a lot of ways, because that's why we said, James White, you aren't part of this camp. you're baptizing 4-year-olds and bringing the Lord's Supper.
At that point, I mean, I appreciate that. I think I would say, like, now we're not talking about baptism necessarily. We're talking about how you parent your kids. So that's different.
We're talking about worldviews and how you see your kids, not just parenting your kids. We're talking about worldviews and how you see your kids. Yeah,
sure. I still think that's a different conversation than baptism, than waiting to baptize your kids. Waiting to baptize believers only.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and that just bring me back to how Presbyterians see the covenantal connection of, like, I don't, I view my kids as part of the covenant people of God, and in the radical Baptist world would generally, they might view their kids as like some good kids growing up in a Christian family, but all their nonverbal communications are communicating to their kids that they aren't part of the family of God until they're ready to identify with Christ and accept Jesus in their heart and get baptized. When I want to say, if mom and dad, one last point here, and then I'll let you have that. Yeah. If mom and dad have me at their own table, why would Jesus not have me at his table? Who's the more gracious father in that circumstance? The earthly father or the father of heaven and earth? And yet I can't eat at the Lord's table, but I can eat at mom and dad's table. I must not be a part of the body of Christ over here, but I'm part of mom and dad's family.
I would object. I agree with most everything you said there. I would object to the ready to identify language. I just don't know anybody. I've never heard that in Baptist circles about I'm ready to identify as a Christian. That does sound like transgender, but that also sounds like trying to import something into. I think what I've heard, if anything, I've heard ready to believe or something like that. But it's generally always about faith and repentance and belief. Not identity, not ready to identify, that kind of language. I could see if that was the widespread practice, then maybe you could maybe even draw some straighter lines. I don't see that. I don't think that's right.
Yeah. No, thank you. I'm gonna let you have the last word here. We've gone on long enough. Hopefully this is a blessing to those who are watching and coming in, but I'll let you have the last word here, Rhett, and then I'll close it out, man.
Well, I would just say thank you for what you guys are doing with Cross Politics and Fight Laugh Feast in general. I think the way you guys have handled this particular controversy has been instructive and how to do it as far as being available, having this conversation. I know you guys have had other ones. I do think if we're going to, I don't say if we're going to move on, I think we're going to move on regardless together. I think I thought this would have blown over by now, to be honest with you. I thought it was done last Monday or Tuesday. I was kind of surprised when it kept going on. I do think y'all are known for hard words. I think that the hard words that y'all want to say, y'all ought to say is, we exaggerated, or we got it wrong, or it was unclear, something along that. I think some acknowledgement there. I don't think you need to come groveling and apologizing and repenting. I don't think there was sin there. I think it was an error. I think you got it wrong. And I think acknowledging in some of that, rather than, I think some of it got blamed on Baptists being too sensitive or not able to take hard words. We're glad to take the hard words. I think it's the accuracy there that we're concerned about, and so that would be my encouragement to you guys is those are some hard words, and so I would encourage you guys in that regard. But other than that, I have benefited. One, just learning a ton from you guys. I have some really good friendships here locally, because of my connection with Fight Laugh Feast. And so there's nothing but a bunch of gratitude, respect, and love from me. And so I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Rhett. And thank you for the conversation and coming on, man. And for being a contributor to the team here.
Sure.
Just to address that last point, I do agree that our show can lend to sloppiness, because you're walking into a bar with 3 Presbyterians and their friends, And then also when we close things out and go to backstage, I agree that can all cause some sloppiness, some ambiguity, and some frustration sometimes for our listeners trying to figure out and pick up where we're at in that. And so that's why I think we needed to clarify and let everybody know this is what we meant. And so I just ask that people would believe our clarifications and all this. And I understand the sloppiness and what that can, how that can contribute to this frustration from my Baptist brother. So that'd be just kind of olive branch there on that side of things. So,
well, I'm looking forward to Knoxville.
Yeah, man. Look forward to seeing you in Knoxville, October 6th through the 8th. Hey, we're going to have a church leadership luncheon on Friday. So stand by for that. I'll get you more information on that. But anyways, so thank you everybody for tuning into Water Break. I hope our dialogue with Rod and Rhett was really helpful in this conversation. And please reach out, contact at fightlaughfeast.com. We hope to see you guys at our conference, and we hope that the church learns how to fight, how to disagree, how to make clarifications, how to acknowledge where they're wrong or where they're sloppy. We hope all that can happen, and that the church can grow from all this and continue to work together to build the church and what's going on in our country. Rod's right in some sense. Rod hits the nail on the head where we got a big fight ahead of us, but we also want to make sure we got clean houses behind us when we go out and to fight the culture. So until next week, thank you for joining Water Break. Till next week, go fight, laugh, and feast.